Ephesians 4 through 6. Well, it's often been noted that Jesus and Paul seem to have different ways of describing becoming a believer. Back in Matthew 7, verses 21 and 24. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them. And then we contrast that with how we've interpreted Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 historically. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. And you can see almost a passivity in how we would define salvation through Paul. Well, I'm recommending again that Jesus and Paul agreed on how to become a believer or be saved. And we said last time Ephesians 2 is probably retelling the story of Gentile inclusion. For it is by favor that you Gentiles have been saved by your loyalty to Jesus. So I would recommend that we still have and this is where Jesus and Paul agree, that loyalty or faith is an aggressive term. It's certainly active. And you show your loyalty to Yahweh and to Jesus, and by that means you're saved. So a good example of how Paul is active in his description of salvation would be the opening verses of our reading today. I ask you to walk worthy of the calling which you are called, with all lowliness of mind, that as you get along as Jew and Gentile, that this lowliness is not just a nice thing to have, but it's required in a sense to be together as a team. Otherwise, you're evidencing that you're not understanding the family that is, again, showing unique loyalty to God, Yahweh, and Jesus. 4 through 7. This is why it was difficult in that day. There is one body, one Spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all. But then he says, to each one is given favor according to Christ's gift. So you have a unique individuality, but a oneness that must be shown. 4:13, till we have all come in the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God to a perfect man. So this idea of mankind or man that is being created. It's a new version of mankind. I like how N.T. Wright's version uses or defines the phrase in 4:13. The purpose of this is that we should all reach unity in our belief and loyalty and in knowing God's Son. It's done as a group, as it were. In other words, coming to understand who God's Son is not an individual affair. It's something we do together as we are each individually very lowly in mind. 4:17 to 20, a good reminder that Gentiles were coming out of a worldview that was not equating worship and morality at all. I say therefore and testify in the Lord that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk in the futility, think of these adjectives, futility of their mind, their understanding darkened, alienated from the life of God, ignorance that is in them, the blindness of their heart, who being past feeling have worked all uncleanness with greediness. So the Gentiles, if we make this group, they're coming from a past that is horrific morally. And they have never tied, previous to this, a Messiah figure to a moral figure. And that's why he ends this, but you have not so learned Christ. When you get to know Jesus, you realize that your past and its behavioral uncleanness and wickedness is antithetical to what this kind of lifestyle should be. Was Jesus' death a sacrifice? We often think of it as a sacrifice in modern thinking, but it's a rather rare moment in the New Testament when Jesus' death and sacrifice are equated. Never in the Gospels, never in Acts. And this is the only time in Paul. 5:2, walk in love as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God. When we get to Hebrews, we'll have a common discussion of Jesus' death as sacrifice, but this is the only one in Ephesians 5:2. Remember again that sacrifices in the Old Testament were only performed by already righteous people as they worshipped Yahweh. So it was a sanctification or a purification moment then, and I'd recommend that's how Gentiles were to think of the death of Christ now. Like Colossians, we have recommendations again in Ephesians about family life. 5:22 and on. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife. Now that idea of a paterfamilias, or a husband being the head of the wife, he's not saying husbands you need to be. He's saying you already are. Think again of how the family in this day worked. This is from families in the New Testament world. Every kinship group in this time period was a worshiping group. The oikos, or the home, was a center of worship with its male head, the paterfamilias, as head of the cult, the wife, the materfamilias, also playing an important role. It is probably because of this integral part played by the wife and mother of the family that Plutarch advises that no matter what gods a bride previously worshipped, in marriage she should cease to worship any but those of her husband. The paterfamilias, in theory, always had the authority to prevent anyone in the household from engaging in activities of which he did not approve. Christians seem quite easily to have run into this problem, hearing of it as a de facto situation in which a spouse is already a Christian and the other is not. We heard about that in 1 Corinthians 7. We'll hear about it in 1 Peter 3. This is an indication that the actual religious interdependence of household members to pursue devotions beyond that of the household is something unique to the Christian experience. This is fascinating, again, that the paterfamilias in any home was responsible for the direction of the worship of that home. And yet in Christianity, we have individuals being held accountable for whom they worship as opposed to their father or mother. Everyone in the family belonged to a family cult, including children and slaves, and in the Roman religion, the whole household gathered daily to invoke the protection of its special deities. Well, again, you have not so learned Christ. That's why this is a difficult religion for the first Christians to understand, because you may act completely different and believe differently from your husband, your wife, even your children. Well, we end with this whole armor of God, a very famous passage. 6:11-13, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand the wiles of the devil. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, this family here, but we wrestle against, and think of Paul's word choice, principalities and powers. These are words that, again, are familiar with Old Testament description of the gods. Against rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. The lack of specificity I find endearing. He doesn't get into naming them. He doesn't get into positioning them in the heavens. He just simply says it's a host of wickedness that's in the heavenly places. And thus we put on the armor of God, very practical items. They're not meant to be mysterious. In the end, what I think Paul is saying, and we get this in 6:20, I am an ambassador in chains. We live in a world under which Christ rules, but as experienced by Paul's chains, we also live in a world that we don't always get what we want.